Welcome to Wealthy Women Warriors Tribe Thrive, helping women in workplaces go from idea to impact without burning out. This show empowers women in workplaces with learning and development tools to transform culture with impactful action. This is the second part to a three-part series entitled Socialized Behaviors That Trigger Implicit Bias and Microaggressions: How to Change Workplace from Within. I'm joined once again by Dr. Cami Anderson and Dr. Joy Wiggins. And this is the second part of our series where we're examining, in this one, microaggressive behavior within the workplace and how to take steps for cultural change. I'm super excited about this one. I'm honored once again to host Dr. Cami Anderson, an interculturalist, scholar, language advocate. She has so many degrees that I tripped on it when I introduced her in the first episode. So hopefully she's forgiven me by now. She's the founder and the CEO of Bilingual Brown Babies and the creator of revolutionary online program that meets Black families where they are in their journey to bilingualism, which I think is super cool. She's passionate. She's a lifelong teacher, and she's a go-to girl when it comes to language, Blackness, and identity. And alongside her is Dr. Joy Wiggins, who received her doctorate from the Ohio State University in multicultural education and social justice. And again, also holds a number of incredible educational accolades. She's also the founder of the CEO of Joy Wiggins Equity and Inclusion Consulting, which provides speaking facilitation mentorship opportunities on topics of power, privilege, race, and gender justice and liberation. So today we're diving into the good stuff. And I call this the good stuff simply because it's happening all over the place. And I'm super excited to talk about it. We've been doing some really great work here in Toronto with some of the training facilities that I have had. It was also what sparked my desire to actually initially connect with you, both of you ladies, because microaggression has become the new way of getting ahead. And it is also the very thing that is creating toxicity within our workplace. So I'm thrilled for both of you to be here. I'm thrilled for us to really unpack this. We are going to be looking at solutions, and 3 specific solutions that we're going to share with you over our next 30-minute episode. So let's dive in. First of all, who wants to talk about or define what a microaggression actually is?
I'm going to defer to Joy. I'm going to let Joy be an ally and define this for us.
I love it.
So I would categorize a microaggression as an everyday slight, that it seems like it's a subtle remark, but it's actually based off of history, stereotypes, and negative assumptions about other people. So a good example of this is asking someone that is of Asian descent, "Where are you from?" as if they are not from here. Assuming that a woman is the secretary and not the leader of the organization. Assuming that a woman is actually one of the scientists or the engineers, assuming that they're also an assistant or something like that. And it's really anything that's based on some kind of negative assumption about somebody else based on stereotypes and histories of marginalization. And so it can be small, it can be big. And sometimes we call them microaggressions, but they can also be called macroaggressions. So they can actually, you think that the impact is small, but it's actually quite great because it's piled on top of many of these everyday small little knife jabs. And we've kind of said that you might think of it like a scab, and that there is a scab that can never really heal because it's constantly being picked at by other people. And so that's one kind of good metaphor, that it's something that's trying to heal, but can never really heal because it's constantly being picked at. And that's those subtle little remarks. It happens every single day. Something that happened just to me yesterday, I was trying to replace the wipers on my windshield. And it was in the middle of pouring rain, and this man walks by and goes, "Oh, good for you for doing that on your own." I'm like, "Oh, for the..." And so I promptly put the wipers in the car and left because I was like, I'm not going to do this in front of the auto parts store. It's just those little, what you would think is a small remark and might have been given with good intent,
Mhm.
but it's based off of a history of power and privilege and marginalization.
I know.
So
And that one to give another example, because this is one that we feel is a compliment that particularly Black and Brown women hear a lot in the workplace. Oh my goodness, you're so articulate. You speak so well.
mm-hmm.
And it's
Isn't
meant
that
as a compliment, but it's
isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
Sorry, I've never heard that before, but
Yeah.
yeah, no doubt. These are the things though that we're not aware of. I always found it offensive. So, and this is, one of the things that always drove me crazy was that people would always, I was always called the pretty one.
Mhm.
Oh, well, you've gotten where you are because you're pretty. And, oh, you actually have something that is articulate that you can say. Good for you. Right. So these are the things that, yeah. And so it's interesting where those stories, that we talked about in our first episode carry forward, and they're what actually create the microaggressions.
Yeah.
And the microaggressions start, I believe, as something that we're unaware of. But then the moment that they create a response, that is where they can be leveraged. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing them being leveraged within the workplace.
Yes. Yeah. It's those and just to make sure that everyone is clear that microbehaviors, like microaggressions, are not just the things that we say, it's also sometimes the things that we do. Mm-hmm. So making sure that we're clear that it's behaviors and words that come with these microaggressions. Mm-hmm. So it can be something where, you have these things that have been said to us, but then it might be these other behaviors that we might do as well, where it might be the ways in which because we don't want to get the angry Black woman, we put emojis in all of our emails to them in order to lighten the mood so they don't get mad. Mm-hmm. That's microaggressive because you're assuming that they're going to get upset. And where is that coming from? What is that history? Mm-hmm. So being able to really look at those things. I know I had a colleague that used to check my credentials just to make sure they were still valid on a regular basis. That's a microaggression because whose degree changes. It doesn't change over the course of time. So being able to really look at not just the things that you say, but also some of the things that you might do that speak to how you've been socialized. So being able to look at both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even, in the boardroom, I find that this happens. This is where a lot of it is happening. These slights are happening. And it is the small things, the assumption that it's the woman who's going to record the meeting minutes. Mm-hmm. It's the assumption that, Sally doesn't have any knowledge in this one sector, so she doesn't get to contribute to this conversation. It's the cutting people off in the middle of, and this happens all the time, in the middle of their sentence when they're trying to articulate something that somebody doesn't necessarily agree with. But the people can't even get their words fully out of their mouth before they are shut down. Mm-hmm. And those are the elements. It's withdrawing information. It's holding information hostage so that your counterparts can't actually get the information that they need in order for a project to move forward. Those are all forms of microaggression.
There are terms that, we use as when we use mansplaining a lot when it comes to how that, but there's also like women of color deal with white-splaining, or let me explain to you why you're so oppressed. I kind of know. So like being able to understand all of these various things that happen in a meeting room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, when you think about, I've made this mistake, what Camille was just talking about, explaining to a woman of color about diversity or whatever, and I'm like, wow, shut up, Joy, because obviously she knows. Like, why are you still telling them? And it's also the same thing with trying to educate men about women's experiences. Really, they should be doing that work themselves. If they're really an ally, they should be doing that work themselves. And and then checking in with you to make sure, like, am I doing this in the ways in which you would like to see it done? not so much educate me, please, or prove to me that women that, are coming forward about sexual harassment are actually telling the truth, and having to educate men on why it's really not comfortable to come forward and talk about sexual harassment and all the risks that happens because of that. That should be something that men should be going out and educating themselves on. And the same thing for white folks too, is they should be going out and educating themselves. So if they think that they've said something wrong, or like, I might have done something, to go out and educate themselves on what they might have said before asking the person that they might have said it to educate them about it.
Right. And that's the thing, like one of the things that because it happens in the classrooms too. And a lot of times, like when I was growing up, I was the first and only, maybe two students of color in the classroom. We get to February, it's Black History Month, and everybody looks at us, waiting for us to be able to corroborate or give them information. And like that's also considered a microaggression, because now you're waiting for us to be able to relive the epigenetics that we were talking about before, relive this trauma in order for you to get educated. And that's oppressive. It's harmful, and we don't realize, because we're like, I'm just trying to get information, and who better than you to tell me? Well, a book could give you the information, and being able to really understand that these things that we feel are innocent, we do have to going back to that self-awareness, make sure that our positioning or our presentation of these inquiries are actually taking into consideration the heart of the person that you're talking to.
And do you feel that the inquiries come, like if they're met, they come from an authentic and a desire to actually learn and know? Is there a different energy that comes behind, that comes through that? Or does it all feel the same? I guess those are the questions that I also look at. And a question that was presented to me about that too, just recently, about talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. And so I guess that's my curiosity is there a way for us to also look at microaggression and understand that not all microaggressions are meant as microaggressions, but they're still interpreted as such by the individual. So how do we find common ground when there is somebody who's being genuine versus somebody who's just digging for stuff?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about with the socialization, like being able to really know stuff. Like we talk about it all the time. Like the good student is the student that does the work beforehand and then asks the questions about the work. It's the same sort of thing for me with microaggressions. I want you to come to me with information. Hey, I saw this and thought X, Y, and Z. Can you confirm, deny, like what can you offer me anything? So don't come with the expectation of my plate is empty, I need you to fill it, but more so, hey, I've got this combination of foods, is this right? So that I can be able to say no, yes, add a little bit of this, put some salt in the corner, whatever it might be, so that they can be able to, so I can see that the effort is that you're genuinely trying to go do the work to get the knowledge, as opposed to waiting on me to just give you the knowledge, and then you can go and figure out what you're going to do with the work.
And as women, like, do you feel that that's what's essentially happening within the workplace? I feel to some extent, it's like, we have all of the, 90%, I'm going to say this quote again, 90% of our women's initiatives are volunteer basis. Even though some of them are major programs within major corporations, 90% of that is all done. Those women are not being paid for them. So I feel like it's almost like, here, we're going to give you a job to go figure out women's equality. We're going to give you this job. We're not going to pay you to do it. And this is what we want you to do. We want you to come to the organization, and we want you to tell us what you need to do in order for us to fix this cultural misconduct.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, we're all in the field, but I think sometimes they do that with the diversity groups too. And it's like, hey, we need diversity. Tell us what we need. It's actually, I'm in an organization where I do sit on the diversity council, and they came to us. They said, we need you to write us recommendations on how we can be more inclusive. No, we need you to write your recommendations for what your inclusivity is going to look like, and we'll let you know whether or not that works.
Yep.
See you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Do your work, do your research.
Right.
Why would you wouldn't do this for any other thing,
Right.
right? Why did they do it around diversity initiatives? You wouldn't just
as well.
do my work for me, and so why did they do it around diversity? I had a similar thing where I was asked to create a diversity task force with 2 other white people.
and it was unpaid.
There wasn't even any money for it either. Like there was, how would we do this?
Yeah.
Right.
What?
No, and it's the same, and we see the same thing with gender and even sexuality. We can start to see with sexuality issues now too, because dealing with this whole conversation, I'm in an organization where we're trying to deal with the whole idea of what does it mean to be have a fluid gender identity. And one of the recommendations was, why don't we just go ask them what they want? No. Why don't we do our own research so that we're informed enough to be able to say, hey, this is what we were thinking. How do you feel about this? Are we missing anything? Does this help you to feel supported? This is what we need to do. It's not about you don't go to the person who's experiencing the marginalization and say, hey, what can we do so you're not marginalized? Well, you're the ones that are doing it. So how about you figure that out? And if I feel included, I'll let you know.
Well, and therein lies the microaggression, which is actually the macroaggression.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is all based in history and socialization and everything else. So yeah, and then if we don't know who we are and how we come into this world and how we navigate relationships with people, then we really are not going to recognize those microaggressions when they're perpetuated against us and against other people. So sometimes there's that internalized oppression for like women in particular. Somebody might have said something to us and we think, that didn't feel quite right, or something's weird about that, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So like an example of that is I was in a committee meeting on social justice, a social justice committee. And we were divided along gendered lines. And one of the men said to us, I was chairing the committee at the time. And I said, I see that we're at an impasse and that we're divided. And I want us just to take a moment to see how we're divided. And the women knew exactly that it was along gendered lines. The men didn't quite get it. So later, when the men decided they wanted to do this event and we didn't want to, I said, okay, well, you're on your own. Well, it ended up that some of the women still had to help them with it because one of them worked underneath the men, one of the men. And then also we wanted to help that other woman who now all the burden was on her. So now all of us went in and decided to do the event anyway and helped her. And so when we came to the table and said this was a problem and we really want to talk about this, one of the men said to us, well, you women, you got so emotional about it. You got so dramatic about it. And you could see just the women's bristling up. And because I've done this work and because I know about this and I've practiced it so much, I said, you may not know this, but women many times are called emotional and dramatic. And there's a long history of that being put into mental institutions and being called hysterical. It started with Salem witch trials. It has gone into the mental health institution where we've been institutionalized because we were trying to stand up for ourselves. So when you say something like that, it has major impact on us. You may not know that, and you may just think you're saying a word, but that word has ripple effects and it has impact. And I think, for him, he just goes, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I'm like, well, now you do. So now don't do that again.
Right. And I think that's part of it because we do kind of walk through, especially the more education we get, we think our vocabulary is just, this is just evidence of who I am. This is showing you how smart I am, but we aren't taught the weight of words. So we're taught words, but we're not taught the weight of words. So we'll say things and then we're just, this is just a word I know. No, there's a history to it. There's ways in which we're even socialized around words. I tell people all the time, like when I'm teaching language, that English is the most awkward language to use in order to speak about race, because race vocabulary is guilt-laden and heavy. So it feels weird. It sounds crazy. And that's because that's the weight that we've given the words.
Right.
So we can't have good conversations around it because of the weight that we have given the words.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
the words actually make an impact within our hormones and our biochemistry. And that's one of the other things that people aren't aware of. They're not aware that words, not only are they weighted, they actually change the emotional component of how we are experiencing our situation. And so in those moments, for some people, using certain words is enough to trigger all of that epigenetic element that, Kami, that you were talking about as well, where all of a sudden we feel a certain way. We don't understand why we feel a certain way. We just know that we're triggered. We just know that word was enough to go, wait a second. And all of a sudden it puts us into this paralysis around how we're showing up and what we're actually coming to the table with. Because all of a sudden that label of that word and that heaviness has not only just been out in the ethers, it's also been internalized. And we're now physically responding to what's happening within our situation.
It's like a linguistic stun gun.
Like, that's a good way to analyze.
What do we do? Like, we don't know how to respond. Oh my goodness! I wasn't expecting it. Two, it feels really crazy, and now I can't move. And by the time I can move, now I think it's too late to address it.
Yeah. Then you're like, oh, you're in the shower and you're like, oh man, that would have been a great response to that.
And we talked about this, in a different call about it being the fight and flight response. And we talked about the paralysis that happens to the meta narratives that are occurring within our own mind. And Connie, you had initially talked about it from the perspective, we're not trained to fight. Women, we're not trained to fight. Our society does not handle emotional, angry women. Depending on ethnicity, that amplifies. When we look at Greta Thunberg, who so many attacked her, and they attacked her not because of what she was saying, I don't believe. I think they attacked her because they couldn't handle seeing a young girl be so angry and so outwardly enraged by what was happening. And that's an example of those words being enough to have a physical biochemical response within our own bodies.
And it's true. When we go back to the socialization, very rarely are women taught to fight. Now I can say that, I was, because my dad, the men in my life were like, oh no, I'm gonna need you to know how to at least do a sucker punch, because you're gonna need to. But it wasn't necessarily to fight other women. It was in protection against the men. So it was still, I know what they're capable of, so let me show you these things to be able to counter that, but not necessarily in terms of you being able to stand up for yourself in any way. You're still not supposed to do that. I just need you to be able to counter any attack that comes at you. And in being socialized that way, when it comes time to in the workplace, what that looks like is someone has said something that is obviously inappropriate or offensive, and we're scared to say something because people are not used to women saying, hey, you can't do that. You can't say that. And I might lose my job because now, or my performance evaluation is going to call me feisty, aggressive. It's going to call me not a team player, unable to get along with others. All of these little things that are negative marks against women, but not against men. Not against men. Men can be aggressive and assertive all they want, but women can't do it because we haven't been taught how to do that. So how do we then make sure that, we need to make sure that the language is the same. So if he can be assertive, I can be assertive because we both have the same job. It has nothing to do with gender. He's a manager, I'm a manager. Managers need to be assertive. I'm a manager. I'm going to be assertive too. And you should be okay with that because the role calls for assertiveness.
And it's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joy.
Oh, well, we can't really do our job either.
Right.
We're not allowed to fight for something, especially if we're doing social justice initiatives. It's weird because you would think that in a social justice circle or in an equity and in diversity and inclusion circle that we should be able to come at this in equal ways, but it's not. It's still problematic. And those socializations and those implicit biases and those microaggressions still come through no matter where you are, because it's still, the expectation is still how we've been socialized. So until we start to really look at that, we cannot start to disrupt these messages of who am I as a leader and what does a woman look like as a leader? And if we are, I remember I took a self-defense class when I was 18 because I thought, well, I'm gonna have to figure out how to fight. And the thing is, though, is that I never stood up for myself verbally because I thought, well, I have to be nice. I have to be a people pleaser. I might lose my job. If I say something, they're going to use that against me later. Whereas, I can see men in meetings saying things all the time and get belligerent and emotional, and then they're fine. There's nothing happens to them. So I think it's really important that we start to teach our girls young how to stand up for themselves, both physically and verbally, and to be able to, so that when the fight comes to them, that they're ready.
Well, and I think that's a good point, because now when we look at the leaders in a lot of the organizations, we have our Gen Xers and we still have our boomers. Yes, we do have, millennials who are coming into leadership as well, but we predominantly still have our Gen X and boomers. And it's interesting because what's starting to happen, and this is where ageism is really playing in, is that the women who were conditioned to behave aggressively the way that the men behaved are now being packaged out because they no longer can handle the way that these women have been groomed to behave, but now they are isolated, they are alone, and a lot of them do not have the compassion. And it doesn't matter whether it's the woman who's in that role or the people who are perceiving her. She has been blacklisted. She has been labeled a certain way, but yet the workplace conformed to allow that behavior to be taught so that that's how she learned to show up. And now she's being packaged out because she's way too aggressive. So it was interesting. There was actually a really great article that showed a male leader essentially berating his team. And then the female leader berating her team using the exact same words. The man was deemed acceptable. The female was not. That is how we've been conditioned. And so now we're starting to see these microaggressions. And so not only are we seeing the microaggressions from the perspective of the male components, we're seeing it as other women who are then deliberately doing things, because we still recognize that there's only one or two at the top. So really, how many positions are there going to be opening up? I got to figure out how to position myself to get where I want to go.
Right. And we look at that as it's a survive and thrive type thing, as
right.
Really looking at it like because we're communal. So how do we then use, as opposed to trying to make this me, how do I make this, hey, let me get in here so that I can be able to open the door wider, because we can't open the door from our side. Right. So if I can just get in, I can just tell them, hey, move back so I can open this door. and being able to give ourselves, being able to allow ourselves the space to look at it that way. Because we look at it as we have to be the only one to get in. And if it's between all of us, it's got to be me. And that we end up doing incorrect things in the process to each other. That's where that sabotage part comes in, because of the ways that we've been socialized around positions and positions of power in the workplace.
There's a great way to think about, I don't know if you've ever seen the Pixar, I think Pixar created it, it's with Pearl in The Office. But what she was doing was that she was aligning herself with the men and behaving like the men, so that when the next woman came in, she was starting to act like the men. And then she realized, but sometimes that self-realization doesn't happen. And so the women that have been there for a while, that had to go through the ranks in the traditional way and having to become basically very man-like in order to keep their position, they think they have to continue that way. And what the new women are doing, the millennials and the Gen Zers are coming in, and they're saying, no, actually, we don't have to do that at all. We can be ourselves. We can be feminine. We can be multiple different ways. We can be, a non-binary. And this is the new way of things. And so I think for what's happening with ageism and things like that is there's this disconnect, because the older women are like, well, this is the way that we've survived.
Right.
And, we have come this far by acting a particular way. So why aren't you acting this way? And this whole new thing, it's now easy for you. It's easy, it's perceived as easy. But there's a whole other set of challenges that the millennials and Gen Zers are facing that the boomers and Gen Xers are not. And so I think, when we talk about the history and we talk about understanding each other's experiences, it's really important to understand both parties and where they're coming from, and why the way that, in the 90s and the 80s and 90s, the way it was to be in the workplace as a woman was way different than it is now.
Sure.
But there's still some other challenges now that perhaps wasn't as apparent because there are more women. And so we're realizing, oh, there's newer things happening that we might not have known before,
Right.
that now we can address.
Yeah, 100%. So let's look at some solutions for microaggressions as we're coming to a close of our second episode. Let's talk a little bit about how to shift microaggressions when they're happening. So let's start with, okay, I'm paralyzed. Something has just been said. Something has just happened, said, or the behavior. What can we do in the moment that it's happening so that we don't stay stuck and we start to move the dial on this?
I think there are two things for me. Because there are those moments where something is said where I'm so stunned I can't say anything in the moment and the person walks away. I have to give myself the grace to say, I can still address this though. And it can be an email, it can be popping my head into your office. Hey, real quick before this day ends, and understanding and giving ourselves the grace to know that it's never too late. So something happened, and it just because the moment passed doesn't mean it's not too late to still bring it up. So for those of us that might not be able to have the strength right now as we're working on this, because we said this was a process, who might not have the strength right now to take that breath and address it immediately, being able to be okay with, but I'm still going to, before this day ends, I'm going to say something to make sure that that wasn't right. That wasn't right. There was no honor there in what you just said. And you might not have realized it, but these are the ways in which I felt dishonored. And I'm really being clear that being dishonored in the workplace means that I can't trust you as a colleague. And we're not going to be productive if I can't trust you as a colleague.
Yeah, I think that I would totally agree with that. And I think when you're stunned and shocked too, it's also giving yourself the grace that, like, no, you're right in thinking this. This was an affront. This was a microaggression. I think many times we kind of go back and forth, like, was it not? I don't know. I think that if it hits you as hard as it does initially, that it more than likely it is a microaggression, and that you are correct in that. I think that's one thing. So giving yourself the grace to know that, yeah, you can address it later, and that it actually is what you think it is. And that, no, maybe it wasn't the person's intent, but they still need to understand their impact, and that you're actually doing them a favor by telling them what they're doing, because you're saving other women and other folks down the line that person might be facing. You have now, you're standing up in solidarity for the other people that are also going to face that from that person. The other thing too is, like, I think that when we position ourselves and say, I'm learning this thing too. So I know that maybe your intent was not to be racist or sexist or to say something offensive, but I'm also learning about what that means, the things that I have done in the past that have been considered a microaggression or offensive. And this is what I've learned from it. So kind of almost aligning, I think this is good for me talking as a white person to another white person to say, I know that you probably didn't mean to do this, but I'm also learning things as well. And this is what I've recently learned, that's cultural appropriation, or, using that term is actually quite offensive because this is the history of it. So I think, giving that person the grace too, and saying, I know you probably didn't intend this, but this is how it's affecting me. And this is the history behind it. And so almost kind of giving them an education in a way that's not, where you have to be re-triggered and that emotional retriggering of it isn't happening, but you can take it from an educational standpoint. And sometimes for white people, that's how they understand things. They don't always understand the emotional impact. And of course, we have to get them to that place of where we do understand the emotional, traumatic impact that their words are saying. But sometimes the door into that is that intellectual way, and then say, this is the history of it, and this is the emotional impact of it as well. So you need to understand that you're double dosing here, not only doing something because it is generationally or historically offensive and currently a problem, but also, this is the emotional trauma that you are triggering in somebody.
And I think, just on the last point of what we can do with microaggressions, it also comes down to also looking at ourselves and acknowledging that when something does happen, it doesn't have to keep happening. And it's our story of how we choose to make a change, to have that conversation, to feel that we are good enough, important enough, that our feelings do matter and that our response is real enough for us to forgive ourselves for burdening it and believing that we're just the punching bag, or we're just supposed to internalize it. And instead of, allowing that next step and that next turn to happen, actually, believing enough in the process that things are getting messy now, and that this is okay. It's okay for your voice to be heard, and it's okay for your feeling to be felt. What's not okay is to keep reliving it without doing something about it. And so forgiving yourself for thinking that you need to do that, but then moving into the next element of, okay, how does my not taking action actually ripple into the world, and what am I choosing to do instead?
Right. And I think that not taking action, being able to think about that is important, because if it's happening to you, chances are it is going to happen again to someone else. And the reaction might be different. That person might not be stunned. and their reaction might be far greater than you saying, hey, I don't think you should do that. And this is why I don't think you should do that. So what are the ways in which you can prevent that from happening again? How can you be the stop block for it not going any further?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Cami and Joy, for, again, another riveting conversation on individual socialization and microaggression in the workplace. This is really, I think, going to be impactful and super supportive for all of our listeners. And we appreciate you coming on. We appreciate all of our listeners for joining us on Wealthy Women Warriors Tribe Thrive. Please join us in the next episode. This is where we're going to get into a very uncomfortable topic for a lot of white women, because we're talking about white women violence. And it's another topic that's happening within the workplace culture. And it's definitely something that we need to identify. So please join us in episode 3, where we'll dive into that and interrupt some of these patterns and look at how we can make awesome cultural changes. Thank you so much. We'll see you in our next episode.